Racist cop pulls over a black widow, then realizes who her son is. Stay tuned, because this one will leave you speechless. It was just after 5 p.m., the sun casting long golden shadows across the sleepy streets of Monroe County, Georgia. Officer Kyle Jennings sat in his cruiser on the shoulder of Ashbury Avenue, a quiet stretch rarely disturbed by more than the occasional speeding teenager or distracted commuter. A decade on the force had dulled much of the thrill, but Kyle still relished the control the badge gave him, especially over those he believed didn't belong. When a sleek black SUV slowly rolled by, its windows tinted just enough to spark his curiosity, Kyle flicked on his lights. No traffic infraction, no call over the radio, just instinct, or at least that's what he told himself. As the vehicle pulled over with quiet compliance, Kyle adjusted his belt, stepped out, and approached with the slow swagger of authority. Behind the wheel sat a woman with deep brown skin and tired, heavy eyes. She was dressed in all black, as if she'd just left a funeral. Her hands remained visible on the wheel. Her lips didn't tremble, but there was something in her stillness, dignified, unflinching, that made Kyle uncomfortable. "License and registration," he said, voice flat, not even offering a greeting. She handed the documents over without a word, her gaze steady. Angela Brooks. The name meant nothing to him then, but her silence, her composure, seemed almost challenging. Kyle didn't realize he had just opened the door to a storm he wasn't ready for. There was a brittle chill in the air that didn't match the summer warmth. Kyle stood at her window, longer than necessary, pretending to scrutinize her license. The tension wasn't in her. No, Angela Brooks sat like marble, still and untouched by the aggression leaking from his posture. It was in him. He narrowed his eyes, leaned in slightly, and asked, "Where you headed in such a hurry?" She met his gaze, soft but unwavering, and replied calmly, "I'm not in a hurry, officer. Is there a reason you pulled me over?" The question stung. There wasn't, but his pride recoiled. "You acting a little too confident for someone pulled over," he said, his tone hardening. Angela blinked once, slowly. "I know my rights," she said, her voice low, almost gentle, as though she were talking to a child throwing a tantrum. Kyle clenched his jaw. That composure, it didn't match what he'd learned to expect. She wasn't afraid, wasn't apologizing, wasn't scrambling to explain, and it unnerved him. He turned on his heel and marched back to his car, gritting his teeth, not because she'd been disrespectful, she hadn't, but because she hadn't given him the power trip he wanted. What he didn't yet know was that the woman he just tried to belittle had already buried a husband who wore a flag on his chest, and raised a son who would one day teach men like Kyle what real courage looked like. Kyle sat in his cruiser, tapping Angela's license against the steering wheel as if it were a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. Something about her expression, so grounded, so firm, stuck with him. Most drivers flinched, panicked, stuttered. Not her. She hadn't rolled her eyes or raised her voice, but she also hadn't shrunk. That calm, steady way she'd looked at him, with the poise of someone used to facing far more threatening storms, had left him unsettled. He typed her name into the system. Angela Brooks. Clean record. Registered address in a respectable part of town. Insurance valid. Registration up to date. Nothing out of place. He stared at the monitor, the cursor blinking. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as if they might summon something more, something hidden beneath the surface. Her name sounded familiar now, as though he'd seen it somewhere other than the DMV database. Kyle leaned back in his seat, flipping her license over, still trying to pinpoint what about her presence was gnawing at his gut. He clicked on the next tab, checking for any emergency contact listings. His eyes scanned the screen quickly until they landed on it. Emergency contact, Captain Elijah Brooks, U.S. Army Special Forces. A defiguration photo of a tall black man in military fatigues, standing at a podium, flanked by officials, shaking hands with the President of the United States. The headline read, "Local soldier honored for valor in hostage rescue operation." Kyle clicked. The article painted a vivid picture. Captain Elijah Brooks had led a high-risk mission in hostile territory to rescue 12 American aid workers from a terrorist stronghold. Lives were saved, enemy lines breached, and not a single soldier lost under his command. He had been called a hero, a national treasure, a symbol of bravery and excellence. The article continued with quotes from Elijah, brief and humble, and then mentioned his upbringing. Raised by a single mother, Angela Brooks, in Georgia, his mother, the widow of Major Darius Brooks, another decorated soldier who had died in combat a decade earlier during a selfless act of protection for his team. The story wasn't just one of a hero, it was one of legacy, of sacrifice embedded deep in blood and bone. Angela Brooks wasn't just the mother of a hero, she was the widow of one too. A woman who had given both her heart and her future to the service of a country that now let its officers treat her like a suspect on the side of a road. Kyle's stomach turned in a slow, guilty twist. It wasn't just the embarrassment of realizing he'd disrespected someone whose son was being saluted in Washington, D.C. It was the gut punch of understanding that this woman, whose patience he had interpreted as defiance, had lived through trials he could never imagine. She had lost her husband to war and watched her son march into the same fire, and still, she had offered him nothing but calm, nothing but quiet dignity. She hadn't name-dropped, hadn't bragged, hadn't fought. She'd let him play his role, knowing he didn't even know the full script. The more he read, the heavier it felt. Angela had spoken at veteran fundraisers. She'd started a local program helping military widows adjust to life after loss. She was beloved in her community, not because of who her family was, but because of who she was. Yet none of that had mattered to Kyle when he saw her through the tinted window. She'd been black, driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood, and that had been enough for him to flick on the sirens. He hadn't asked where she was going. He hadn't even tried to explain why he pulled her over. And she hadn't asked for justification. She'd simply sat, waited, endured. Back in the squad car, the hum of the computer seemed louder now, each flickering detail on the screen echoing a truth Kyle had spent his whole career ignoring. Respect shouldn't be earned through medals. Worth shouldn't be proven with obituaries or sacrifice. Angela Brooks didn't deserve dignity because her son was a war hero or her husband died in uniform. She deserved it because she was human, because she existed. And yet, she had to carry that invisible armor of patience, built from years of navigating a world that questioned her presence at every turn. Kyle stared at her license again, but this time it felt like it weighed 50 pounds. He imagined her driving down this road, maybe on her way back from a visit to her husband's grave, maybe coming from a veteran's ceremony, dressed in black not just for fashion, but for mourning that never quite fades. He saw the steadiness in her hands now as something else. Strength born from grief, from love, from 1,000 days of silent resilience. She had been through battles he couldn't name, and yet, in her stillness, she had treated him with more respect than he had shown her. Kyle looked up through the windshield. Angela was still sitting there, in her car, engine running, gaze fixed straight ahead. She hadn't moved. She hadn't picked up her phone or honked or rolled down the window. She waited, because that's what she had always done. Waited for the world to catch up. Waited for men like him to see. The clicking of Kyle's keyboard slowed as the full weight of the information settled over him. The silence inside his cruiser was no longer the comfortable quiet of authority. It was thick, heavy, laced with the knowledge that he had misjudged a woman who had likely endured more than he could begin to comprehend. Captain Elijah Brooks. Her son. The name now rang like a drumbeat in his ears. A national hero. A man whose actions had not only made headlines, but had saved lives and inspired countless others. And yet, the moment that stuck with Kyle wasn't the president shaking Elijah and or the medals on his uniform. It was that line in the article, raised by his mother, Angela Brooks, after the loss of his father, Major Darius Brooks. Kyle read it again, then again, slower each time, until the name carved its place in his memory. Darius Brooks. That name didn't just echo through the article. It echoed through military circles, veterans' halls, and war memorials. Kyle remembered now. He had seen it on a plaque at the state capitol years ago, alongside a photo and the words, "Courage Beyond Measure." Darius had died shielding his platoon from an ambush, absorbing enemy fire while his men fled to safety. It was an act of pure self-sacrifice, the kind they made movies about, the kind that earned not just medals, but legacy. Kyle hadn't connected the dots until now. He hadn't needed to, until Angela Brooks became just another target for his suspicion. The wife of a hero, the mother of another. And yet she'd been stopped, questioned, and spoken to like she didn't belong. Kyle swallowed hard, a sharp knot building in his throat. It was impossible now to ignore the quiet reverence of that family's history. The way both father and son had offered up their lives in different wars, in different generations, for a country that still allowed its protectors to be profiled, dismissed, or disrespected the moment they stepped out of uniform. Angela had worn no badge, no uniform, no medal. She was simply herself. And for that, Kyle had deemed her suspicious. And after that, Kyle had deemed her suspicious. The screen now felt like a confession booth, each line a testimony to her endurance. The public had watched Elijah receive his honors, but they hadn't seen Angela sitting in the front, holding back tears. They hadn't seen the years she'd spent raising a child without a partner, explaining why the flag on his father's casket meant something more than death. They hadn't seen the hospital visits, the lonely holidays, the conversations about courage and grief that no mother should have to have. Yet Angela had done it all, and she had done it with grace. Kyle pictured her again behind the wheel, dressed in black, hands steady on the leather. It wasn't just about losing a husband or raising a son who would later serve. It was about how she had done it, without bitterness, without entitlement, and without ever asking for more than basic respect. He thought about the small gold chain she wore, something he hadn't even registered earlier. He now realized it had a single charm, shaped like a pair of dog tags. A subtle tribute worn close to her heart, not for others to see, but as a private reminder of the life she'd lived and the sacrifices she'd carried. His thoughts were interrupted by the memory of her voice, soft, measured, unwavering. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" It hadn't been defiant. It had been honest, an earnest question that should have made him think twice, but instead had triggered something defensive in him. He had accused her of being too confident, He had bristled at the idea of a black woman being composed under pressure, but now he saw it for what it truly was: resilience. That confidence he had mistaken for arrogance was survival, molded through years of shouldering pain most people couldn't name. His hands, now slightly trembling, went back to the keyboard. He typed in Angela Brooks' military widow speech, unsure what he was searching for. A video popped up, low quality, taken at a community veterans event 2 years prior. He clicked. There she was, standing at a podium in a modest black blazer, holding a folded piece of paper. The crowd was silent as she spoke. "My husband didn't die with a weapon in his hand. He died with a prayer on his lips, covering the bodies of his men. He gave his life for them the way he had once promised to give it for me. I raised our son to understand that sacrifice is not always seen, but it's always felt. We wear it in our silence. We carry it in our dignity." Kyle leaned closer to the screen. Her voice was steady, almost melodic. There was no bitterness, no anger, just truth, spoken plainly and beautifully. The audience had wiped away tears. She wasn't just someone who'd endured loss. She wasn't just someone who'd endured loss, had transformed it into strength, into purpose, into the kind of wisdom that couldn't be learned, only lived. The camera had panned to Elijah in the crowd, sitting tall in uniform, eyes fixed on his mother with the kind of reverence that only a son can offer. It wasn't just pride, it was all. Kyle felt it too now, even through the screen. It was overwhelming. A woman who had been belittled on the side of the road for doing nothing wrong had stood at that podium and spoken words that could silence a stadium. She had lived through war, through burial, through years of being underestimated, and still she had risen, every time with her back straight and her spirit intact. Ed. Kyle stepped out of the cruiser with a heaviness in his chest he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The warmth of the Georgia sun had long faded behind cloud cover. Or perhaps it just felt colder now because of the weight of shame resting on his shoulders. He clutched Angela's license and registration in his hand like a child returning something he had no right to take. As he neared her window again, her eyes, never still calm, still unreadable. He didn't know how to begin. Everything he'd prepared, every official-sounding phrase, every line he might use to mask his guilt, dissolved the moment he opened his mouth. "Ma'am, He paused, cleared his throat. His voice cracked, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide it. "I didn't know who you were." The words felt pitiful as they came out. She tilted her head slightly, expression soft but firm, the kind that reminded you she'd had to accept 1,000 apologies in her lifetime, most of them too late. Kyle forced himself to look her in the eye. "I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. I shouldn't have pulled you over." His voice had dropped to almost a whisper, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling like a weight pressing into his ribs. Angela didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't interrupt. She simply waited, letting the silence stretch in the space between them. And then, in the gentlest voice he'd ever heard, she said, "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. No anger, no edge, just truth, spoken without adornment." Kyle felt it strike like a hammer against the hollow parts of himself he hadn't known were there. That one sentence told him everything he'd failed to learn in his years of law enforcement. About power, about humanity, about what it means to see someone as a whole person, not just a profile behind a windshield. He nodded, slowly, mouth dry, then turned and walked back to his cruiser, his ears ringing with the echo of her words. Behind him, Angela didn't drive off. She didn't speed away in anger or triumph. She sat for a few moments, watching him disappear into the car, then calmly turned her key and merged back onto the road with the same grace she'd arrived in. But someone else had been watching. From the corner across the street, a teenager with a phone in his hand had filmed the entire interaction. From the tone Kyle had used in his first approach to the uncomfortable silence that had hung over his apology, the video hit social media within hours. It wasn't the kind of loud, dramatic confrontation that usually went viral. No one screamed, no one was cuffed. But that's why it hit harder. The footage showed a calm black woman, treated with unwarranted suspicion, and then later met with the awkward repentance of a white officer realizing his mistake too late. Angela's demeanor, her stillness, her poise, captured hearts. Her one sentence, caught clearly on the teenager's video, became a rallying cry. You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. By the next morning, the video had over 500,000 views. News outlets picked it up. Comment sections overflowed, not with outrage alone, but with something deeper: admiration. People wanted to know who she was, and when they did, when they discovered her connection to 2 generations of military heroes, the story took on an even more profound weight. Yet the praise wasn't just for her family. It was for her grace, her restraint, her ability to embody dignity in a moment when most would have responded with justified anger. Angela never posted a response. She didn't grant interviews or give press statements. She simply continued her life, as she always had, grounded and quiet in her strength. But across the country, something shifted. Her son Elijah, stationed overseas, saw the clip during his break and wrote a brief message online. "That's my mother. Everything I've done, I did with her courage behind me." His words went viral. Not because he was a hero, but because he reminded everyone that true courage doesn't always wear a uniform. It often rides in silence, behind a steering wheel, enduring judgment without ever losing its grace. At the next city council meeting, the mayor opened with a moment of silence for military families and then read aloud Angela's words. Murmurs of change stirred. Police departments shared the clip in internal trainings. And somewhere on a quiet Georgia road, another officer thought twice before flipping on his lights. Not because of fear, not because of headlines, but because he remembered the still, proud eyes of a widow in black who had already given enough to a country that still owed her its respect. And there you have it. Another powerful tale from one storyteller, where the truth demands to be heard. If this story moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a moment, where justice, heart, and humanity collide. Until next time, keep watching, because stories like these deserve to be told.